Career podcast series featuring conversations with professional creatives from the arts, entertainment, and media industries. Here we explore various approaches to craft and career, and even consider how these two can sometimes work together. I'm Derek Webster, Senior Associate Director for Creative Careers at Yale's Office of Career Strategy, and I'm excited to introduce our next guest, award-winning journalist, NFL analyst, podcast host, ESPN contributor, and all-around multimedia dervish, Mina Kimes. Mina, we're so excited to have you on the podcast. So as we open this kind of a dialogue, it's normally looking in the direction of this bifurcation, right? This idea that careers can go in a couple of different directions, but whenever there's a creative, a generative, an element where you're making things and caring about things, sometimes there's a split. And in that split, we will sometimes think about it as being a person's career versus their craft. So I wondered, maybe just to get those terms kind of, at least on your side, like what does that really mean? Like, what do you think of as your career?
Oh, man. My career has changed a lot. It's changed. I've gone through multiple shifts, going from being a business journalist to being a sports writer, then going from being a sports writer to being an analyst, which was actually the more dramatic shift. We can talk about that, but
right.
Yeah. So there are definitely through lines, and I'd say the through lines are more apparent in craft when we talk about sort of the actual doing of the job. But so throughout it all, I think I've been a communicator. I don't think of myself as a journalist now, but I've been someone who works in media, I would say. Probably when I think about just describing the career as a whole, it is that working in media, being someone who communicates to a mass audience, but what I'm communicating and the way I'm doing it has changed quite a bit.
Sure. Yeah. As will happen over time. And so the second part, the craft part, and this one can be, quite personalized, quite nuanced, just in terms of sometimes it's about the skill involved. Sometimes it's about the creative disciplines that you're carrying over and drawing from. When you think about kind of the craftiness of what you do, what is that through line? Like how would you define that?
So I would say the commonality between going back to just the sort of early part of my career, being someone who wrote about investing and finance, to then, doing more investigative stuff, through now where I'm on TV talking about football every day, is doing a lot of researching, thinking, private thinking, sort of absorbing information as fast as possible, and then figuring out how to synthesize it and convey it, ideally in an entertaining fashion. So when you boil it down to the parts, I'm still doing the same thing I was doing in my early 20s, just very, very different on its face. And
what is the inspiration of that part for you? And this is a difficult question, I know, but like, where's that drawing from? Like, where's the well that you're kind of, pumping the energy from for the things that get you going and get you communicating and entertaining people and doing all those sorts of things?
This actually goes back to college for me at Yale. I always loved that feeling when you were like writing a paper and you do all this reading and thinking. And then I was always like a very avid outliner, which is funny because I think that's another through line in craft for me. As a features writer, I spent more time writing my outlines than the actual stories. And now before I go on TV, I don't write what I'm going to say, but I kind of outline my thoughts. And I always love that moment where it clicks, where you're like, okay, I have all this information. And then suddenly it's kind of like, almost like a telestration in your head, or like you're seeing suddenly the pieces all falling together and you realize, oh, this is how I put it all together in a way where people are going to understand. And it's that moment for me that's the most inspiring, and that really gets me going, is when that moment when I realize, oh, okay, this is all this information, all this research, all this tape study now, all this statistical work, all of it comes together, and I realize this is what is going to make it click in other people's minds.
Are there any sources that you draw from that would not be what we sort of superficially don't seem related to what you do on a daily basis? Are there things that inspire you that you're reading, watching, drawing from, even quietly?
Yeah, I love great communicators, I guess. So, and I read a lot. I read a lot about non-football or not sports related journalism in particular. And so when I read really great magazine journalism, like a great New Yorker piece, and I notice like a turn of phrase or the structuring of an argument in an essay, sometimes I'll sort of internalize that. I actually was just, this is a unusual one. I was just talking to someone at ESPN about making YouTube videos and digital videos and explaining things. And I mentioned I was just watching, those Katie Porter videos that go viral where she uses a whiteboard to make a point in Congress. Yeah. I was like, you know what? There's something there, I think, for explaining sports concepts. I use a lot of statistics as well. So that's an example to me of a great communicator, even though obviously it has nothing to do with sports.
Sure. Yeah. No, I like that. That is a great example. Wondering too, across all the different kind of practices, and we in this podcast and also just Yale working with undergrads in our office, so many different disciplines, so many different interests. And as you probably remember, Yale kind of wants you to go out there and explore and try on different things. And even if you're really good in one section, like you try something else. Wondering how you both think about and maintain one commonality would be a community of practice, right? The other people that are doing similar things that you're able to talk shop with, that you're able to compare notes, that you're able to look at each other's stuff and give feedback and that sort of thing. One, how important is that in your current role and how you've manifested? And then two, how'd you build it and make sure that that's there for you?
Yeah, I mean, it's crucial. It was crucial when I was a business journalist, sports writer. It's especially crucial now, I would say, as an analyst, which is interesting because those relationships with your industry peers, and for me, that's a wide variety of people ranging from sports analytics people to sports writers to bloggers and podcasts to the people who I'm mostly on television with, which are former athletes. I'm only on TV max 2 hours a day, usually 1 hour a day, right? So that's only the tip of the iceberg of the work I do. Most of that work is watching, reading, doing stat stuff. But a lot of it is also just conversations that I'm having all day, sometimes on phone, sometimes on text, sometimes in group chats with the people that I mentioned. Mm-hmm. Conversations that are important, not just from bouncing around ideas and I change my mind all the time and we're sharing thoughts and whatnot. But also, I think cultivating the relationships that are kind of the foundation of what you see on TV. I always tell people that the show that I'm on ESPN is called NFL Live. I think it works entirely because it's based on just hours and hours of talking outside of the show. So you only see like a little bit. And right. those kind of not only build the substance of the conversations, but also the deep relationships that manifest themselves on air.
Yeah, that's great. And good also to kind of identify some of that shared energy of collaborative nature of what you're doing as it compares, across, again, many of like the creative fields that we're looking at more commonly. Back to the career side of things, you already kind of mentioned the idea that you started, business reporting and so there's steps along the way and kind of pivots or not even pivots. I mean, you can better explain exactly what they were that sort of broached into these directions. Could you tell us a little bit more about what maybe started you and any kernels that existed even prior that, had one guessed where you would land where you are now? Any signposts along the way?
It's like I said, I've had two major real pivots, I think, in my career. One going from business to sports, the other going from being an analyst to being a reporter to being an analyst. Going from business to sports, there was nothing I did as a business journalist that signified I might make that move, frankly. The actual nature of the job is pretty similar in terms of going, I was a features writer as a business journalist, supposed to more of an investigative reporter. But when I moved to ESPN as a writer, was writing features. So the actual substance of doing the job, pretty similar, just the subject matter was different and required different things. And, but there was nothing in my business journalism that suggested I could do that. I would say the reason ESPN approached me and ultimately the reason I made that transition was outside of work, actually. It was like a hobby that became kind of all consuming. And also because of social media, I was able to share that hobby or write about it, ultimately post about it, engage with other people about it. So that's kind of where that kernel existed publicly. Going from being a sports writer to being an analyst, to answer your question, that I think there were absolutely for a couple of things. One is that when I was a sports writer, I would go on television to talk about my stories, comment at ESPN. And I just enjoyed it. I enjoyed the craft of it, it's a different kind of work, the performance, which I'd never been a performer before, the gamesmanship, sort of the way it makes you use different parts of your brain. And then also in my writing, I started being a little bit more analytical about the game itself. And that's what I do now, right? As an analyst, is I give my opinions about the sport, which is not something I did at the beginning of my writing career, but something I did a little bit more and more.
Yeah. Wondering too, because some of our audience are going to be, young interests in breaking into where you are now. And you followed a path where strict journalism, investigative reporting, that's not necessarily where, some of these people will be starting. So I'm wondering if you had any advice kind of, retrofitting the idea of like how to get to not exactly where you are, but in the area that you're in. What should, young creatives, young media interested, and particularly sports media interested students be thinking about?
My position is a little bit unique insofar as, well, it's very unique.
Yeah, for sure.
Almost all analysts on television are former players. There's a couple former journalists, especially notably at ESPN. Stephen A. Smith, who's the host of First Take and does a zillion things and is extremely famous, was a writer at one point.
Yeah.
Zach Lowe is a friend of mine who does basketball, is a writer, but he does what I do, where he's on TV also giving his opinions alongside former players. But there are, I think, increasingly roles in the opinion space for people who weren't players at the highest level. And some of that's digital video, podcasting. There are other roles on TV. The show that I started on, Around the Horn, is one where former reporters give their opinions on air. That's a kind of a stepping stone for a lot of reporters doing TV. So there's a lot of pathways, I think, towards going from being a reporter, which I think people understand that path, to being more of a personality. I think, the most valuable thing you can do, and I say this when I kind of see the young writers and reporters who are kind of interested in taking that step, or just being more of a media, being more multi-platform or whatnot, is developing expertise, showing that expertise, finding ways to express that on social media, making their own videos, podcasts, whatever, using social media to show their personalities, getting practice and reps in talking about sports. A step in my career that I sort of don't talk about that much, or whatever, it wasn't that visible, was when I went from being a writer to being an analyst. There was an in-between stage where I did a lot of sports radio. My first gig as an opinionator at ESPN was working on a fantasy football show on Sunday mornings in Connecticut at 6 a.m., which was really, really not the most fun at times, but necessary practice. So I think it's finding places to practice giving your opinion confidently, fun, so you can learn to be yourself on air, which is a lot harder than just saying be yourself.
Yeah, of course. Now you bring something up I was going to ask or mention. Interesting, just the landscape of in the last, let's say 15, 20 years, how fantasy sports have become so prominent. What are your thoughts on incorporating that if someone is not big into fantasy sports, how the import of becoming bigger into fantasy sports in order to actually be on the pulse of what's happening in the sports world?
Yeah, it's a huge reason why football in particular is so unbelievably popular at a national level. And it's one of the many, when I spoke about, people who want to become opinionators or give their opinions, it is definitely a stepping stone, or not just a stepping stone, but a possible destination if you really love it, because it is one of the places where, you definitely don't have to be a former player. It's based on kind of research and then personality and that sorts of things. So it's really valuable if you're interested in, especially in football in particular, I would say, talking about it, less so other sports on a broader level. But yeah, it's pretty hard to avoid it or ignore it at this point. It's so big.
Yeah, for sure. So now, as you've landed in the current roles and kind of even the stage you've been on for a while now, what does an average day look like for you?
Very different depending on whether it's in the football season or not. But so in the season, and then of course whether it's a Sunday, Monday, or Thursday versus another day. I mean, I typically work, 6 days a week during the season. I mean, I work every day, but I'm really working 6 days a week. Yeah. On Sundays, on game days, but particularly on Sundays, the shows I'm on Monday, NFL Live, Sports Center, but really NFL Live, I'm on 3 days a week. we are in constant dialogue about, meaning like chats, Slacks, whatnot, about the games that we're watching, just to make sure everybody's kind of locked into the games we're going to focus on the next day on television. And then we have chats with kind of ongoing dialogues about the things we find interesting. For me, as I'm watching those games, usually I have multiple screens up with different games, but it's kind of focused, again, based on what I know we're going to be dialed into. But that can, of course, change if you have a crazy ending.
Yeah.
I'm taking notes, usually writing down plays, observations. I'll have various databases open, so I'm collecting statistics. With games, it takes a while to get all the statistics, obviously, you understand, but also to get the coaches tape that we don't get until next. So you have to wait to watch the all 22 of the game so you can actually see everything that's going on. But generally speaking, I'm just taking notes. I have documents open that I use not only for NFL Live, but also for my podcast. So throughout the week, that's an ongoing thing where and then I have time on Monday morning, I'll go back, okay, I'll watch this game, taking notes, So It's a lot of watching film, taking notes, gathering statistics. Then there's the actual making of the shows. NFL Live, for example, every morning, I'm on 3 days a week during the season. We have a call. You have a call with a producer about 8 a.m. Pacific, my time. Then we have a show-wide call where we all kind of generally discuss the stuff we want to talk about on the show, facilitated by a producer. Usually I do that while I'm getting my hair and makeup done for the show.
Wow.
And then I have like a little bit of time to think about what I want to say. Sometimes, just kind of sit with my thoughts, do what I was describing earlier, which is kind of synthesize everything. And I'm not writing down what I'm going to say, but I'll kind of have the broad, I'll write down the statistics I want to use, things like that. Other shows like Around the Horn, there's a pre-show call. There's a document that goes around with research that, because it covers a gamut, a wide variety of sports. So all these shows have researchers, but that show in particular, there's a packet that goes around that I use. First Take, I'm on Thursdays, very early in the morning, Pacific. The producers send out questions the night before saying, what do you think about these things? Basically, so they can figure out what makes for interesting debates the next day. That show is less involved. There's not like a research packet or anything like that. So every show has a different process, different schedule, different number of meetings required. Some don't require any meetings at all. And so for me, it's kind of just like managing all of the different schedules for myself.
Sounds like a busy 6 days plus. So.
I also do my own podcast twice a week, which is, I work with my own producer and we book guests and
that one even extra entrepreneurial, I suppose, and just all the different pieces that you're involved in. So I wonder if you could maybe we'll wrap up for this first segment maybe with do you have any anecdotes or stories or sort of just examples that can give our audience a sense of you already gave us like the walkthrough of like what a schedule might look like on paper, but when it actually lives and breathes, like what does it really feel like?
The way I would describe it is the best sports television, in my experience, is kind of when it feels like a super elevated version of a conversation you'd have at a sports bar with your friends. NFL Live, we do a lot of it remotely, but then we're also on location. We'll tape our show on set at the Super Bowl or the draft or whatever. And some of the most fun moments are like when news breaks and everything I just described to you, all the work, all the prep, we send in tapes, we've got graphics, we've got it rundown. It all goes down the window. Adam Schefter comes on the screen. I remember actually at the draft in Cleveland. So I was like 2020. It was the year Jordan Love was drafted, I think, for the Packers. Anyway, so Adam Schefter comes on. He's like, Aaron Rodgers wants to trade. And we just blew up. It was me, the usual crew, Dan Orlovsky, Marcus Spears, Ryan Clark, Laura Rutledge. And we just reacted to that for the next 45 minutes. And that's what, or big stories like Dan Snyder stepping down as the owner in Washington. There are these moments, all this prep goes into it, but there are also moments where you just have to react to things. And that's to me also extremely fun. It's another aspect of the job I didn't really describe, which is just being live on television, but then, reacting to things as they happen and trying to forget the fact that, 600,000 people or whatever are watching, which is a big part of doing the job.
That's great. So much more to go into. We'll take a break here and come back around. Mina, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. I can't wait to continue this conversation. To our listeners, make sure to check back in next week to hear more from Mina Kimes. And until next time, don't be afraid to use the word career, but always stay crafty.